Welcome everybody to plant ecology, or general plant ecology for undergraduates. This is the first of your video lectures. For the most part, I'm going to be producing these video lectures to go alongside lectures that you'll be hearing obviously in class. For two reasons. One is to keep the lectures in class short so that we can concentrate on other activities and discussions. And the other reason is so that you can use these lectures for more focused study. So for instance, later this week, the second video will be all about photosynthesis, and it will just be a video about photosynthesis. So it will be a good way, hopefully, for you to direct your studies on certain topics. This video is just a broad introduction to ecology generally and plant ecology specifically. So ecology, broadly, is the study of the relationships between living organisms and their environment. It's sometimes thought of as the oldest science because our prehistoric ancestors would have had pretty pressing needs to understand their environment. So knowing which plants were palatable, which were toxic, and crucially, knowing how to avoid predation. And while for most of us, that most basic need to understand our surrounding environment is less relevant today, there are still plenty of reasons why understanding ecology, and particularly the ecology of plants, is crucial to humans today. And chief among those reasons from a human standpoint is our need to be able to control plants and maximise our yield from them in an agricultural sense in order to feed a growing population. But when we talk about what makes plants important, I'm kind of loath to focus too much on the human side of things. One of the biggest and most obvious reasons why plants are so important is that they're the primary producers in most ecosystems. So these are the organisms that are able to harness energy from the sun and turn it into a form of energy that's consumable by basically every other animal and most organisms on the planet today. So you can't really overstate the importance of plants from that. So in a related point, plants are the organisms that are able to photosynthesize, fix carbon in the atmosphere, and create the oxygen-rich atmosphere that basically supports all of life. And so again, it can't really be overstated, the importance of plants to the natural world and to life itself. So I hope I've convinced you that plants are organisms well worthy of study, and I'm going to explain for a little while now the different ways that we go about studying plants. And the first way to divide those kind of studies up is into levels of organisation. So we can study plants at various different levels in what we call a hierarchy. So in your general biology classes, you may remember looking at things from the point of view of molecules, and then from the point of view of cells and tissues and organs, and then whole organisms. In this case, we have a similar hierarchy, starting with individual plants and moving up to populations. So to give you a definition, a population is a group of individuals of the same species existing in a certain place. Then we can study communities. So a community is essentially a group of populations living in the same place. An ecosystem is a community plus abiotic factors. So what we mean by abiotic factors are things like light, temperature, climatic conditions. And then finally, biomes. So a biome is a group of communities or ecosystems shaped by the climate of the area. And so there are five most commonly described biomes: aquatic biomes, forest biomes, grassland biomes, tundra, and desert. And in this case, I've organised them in order of water abundance. But there are various different ways that you can analyse and think about biomes, and we're going to talk about that in a future lecture as well. So with those different hierarchy levels in mind, I wanted to introduce a couple of terms that we use to describe the study of ecology at different levels of that hierarchy. So first of all, you have horticology, which focuses on the properties of individuals, so physiological traits like growth rates or rates of flowering, timing of flowering, etc., and biophysical traits. Secondly, we have demecology, which is the ecology of populations, so things like demographic studies and evolutionary studies at the level of a population. And finally, we have synecology. So synecology is focusing on whole communities. So that's looking at things like vegetation over geographic regions, paleoecology, so study of the fossil record, to look at relationships between different plants and where they've evolved from and who they share ancestry with. So a broader look at botanical systems. So I wanted to introduce you to the kinds of questions that plant ecologists might ask at these different levels of ecology. So to take a kind of case study, this is Lygodium microphyllum, which is a very invasive climbing fern that's prevalent throughout parts of the Everglades and the Florida Keys. And from an horticology point of view, so looking at the point of view or the perspective of the individual, we might ask the question, how do fires that occur naturally in the Everglades affect the reproductive success of these plants, or the distribution of spores of these plants? So what we're looking at now is the same species, Lygodium microphyllum, over a broader scale. And as I mentioned, it's an invasive species, and we'll talk a little bit more about invasiveness later on in the course. But invasive species often lack natural herbivores that would usually eat them, or competition from other plant species. And so you can see fairly easily that this invasive plant is having a devastating impact on local communities and the ecosystem as a whole. So from a synecology point of view, we might ask the question, for example, how does the presence of Lygodium microphyllum affect species diversity in the area? Or how does the presence of Lygodium microphyllum affect primary productivity, so overall kind of photosynthetic productiveness of the ecosystem? So ecology is a pretty broad field, and it's divided into a host of sub-disciplines. So the kinds of questions that we can ask when studying plant ecology are extremely wide-ranging. So I want to introduce you to some of those sub-disciplines and some of the kinds of questions that plant ecologists ask. So for example, biogeography is the study of the geographic distributions of species. So for example, we ask questions like, how does species diversity change as we move from the poles to the equator? And as you'd expect, we see an increase in species diversity as we move towards the tropics from the poles. So chemical ecology is the study of chemicals produced by plants and responded to by plants. So plants can produce chemicals that attract defensive insects to prevent them from suffering too much herbivory. And in some cases, plants can even respond to chemicals produced by other plants. So for example, if a plant is suffering a lot of herbivory, it might produce a lot of volatile chemicals that neighbouring plants can actually respond to and increase their level of defence or defensive traits prematurely in response to the presence of herbivores. Conservation ecology, so that's the study of how can we reduce the risk of species extinction. Ecological succession, so that's looking at the changes in vegetation over time. So we might ask questions like, how long does it take for certain habitats to recover from natural events like hurricanes? Evolutionary ecology, so the study of evolution in the context of populations and communities in which organisms exist. So maybe in an agricultural setting, we might ask, how does the use of pesticides affect the inheritance of traits in populations of pest insects? Fire ecology, we've kind of covered to a certain extent already, and we'll look at that a lot more over the course of the semester. But what are the effects of fire on ecological communities? So for example, we could ask the question, can we use fire as a method of controlling invasive species like Lygodium microphyllum that you saw earlier on in the presentation? So landscape ecology, that's the study of interactions between discrete elements of the landscape. So maybe we could look at how vegetation cover changes as we move, say, up a mountain. So with different levels of elevation, what happens to the ecosystem and the vegetation cover as those conditions change. Paleoecology is the study of plant fossils. So what we look at a lot is the fossils of pollen grains, remnants of plant tissues, and we can look at the relatedness between species, the times in evolutionary history where the different plant families and groups of plants might have evolved. And finally, urban ecology, which is one of the newest forms of ecology. So it's kind of looking at plants in the Anthropocene, so in an era where so many landscapes, arguably all landscapes, have been touched and changed by humans. What are the effects that humans are having on ecosystems overall? So we might ask a question like, how do plants that we put into urban environments, to what extent do they support different assemblages of insects? To what extent do they provide connectivity for plants and animals between patches of natural habitat? And so these are all different branches of ecology that we'll touch on over the course of the semester. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the broad suite of ideas that come out of plant ecology. So we've talked a lot about the kinds of questions that are addressed by plant ecologists. And the way that we address those questions is using the scientific method. So I won't dwell on this, I know most of you will be familiar. But for anyone who isn't, scientific method is a specific set or circular cycle of stages that we go through in order to address scientific questions. So we start by making observations. And this is one of the skills that scientists develop over time, is the ability to see patterns in the environment that they can then focus in on and try to understand better what causes or drives those patterns, what are the processes behind them. So eventually we'll describe those patterns and develop hypotheses about them, and then we'll conduct experiments to try and either verify or reject those hypotheses. And whether or not those hypotheses are verified or rejected, the cycle kind of starts again, either to reevaluate the hypotheses if they were rejected, or to kind of add different levels to the theory if we've verified our hypotheses. And the word theory is kind of the only part of this scientific method that I want to dwell on, because I think for anyone who's not coming at this from a purely scientific point of view, there's a lot of misunderstanding around the word theory. So in general parlance, we talk about theory as being kind of a hunch you might have, based sometimes on very little evidence. Whereas in science, a theory is something that's developed over years or perhaps decades of research. So when we talk about the theory of gravity, the theory of evolution, we're talking about much more than a hunch. We're talking about something that's been verified and supported by years and years of research. So I wanted to use a simple example just to illustrate the scientific method. Scientists from FIU have made observations of this plant. This is the butterfly pea. And two things that they observed early on was, first of all, that these plants are pollinated by bumblebees. And secondly, that the flowers of these plants are sometimes damaged by several insects, some flies that suck the sap from the petals, and also blister beetles that actually feed on the petals some of the time. So having made those observations, you might ask the following questions. So do damaged flowers get pollinated? Do they still get visited by bees? And you might formulate the hypothesis that damaged flowers are less attractive to bees and they'll be visited and pollinated less frequently. So these are the results of an observational study designed to test that hypothesis. So the three sets of bars are flowers from three groups. Firstly, flowers that were damaged by blister beetles, then flowers that were damaged by flies, and then control flowers that hadn't received any damage. Then on the y-axis you have visitation rate by bees. And so you can see that those undamaged flowers were visited more frequently by bees. And so we can validate our hypothesis there. We have to back that validation up with statistics, and so what the letters above those bars indicate are statistical differences between the values. So those B's above the control bars indicate that those values are significantly different from any of those other 4 bars labelled with the letter A. So as I mentioned, this is an example of an observational study, but experiments in plant ecology generally are divided into 3 subcategories. So the first is observational studies like this one. So this is just an observation of events in the natural environment, so we're not manipulating anything. The second kind of experiment are natural experiments. So these are experiments that utilize natural events. So for example, we might be looking at the effects of a hurricane on an ecosystem. So we might compare conditions before and after the hurricane, or we might look at recovery rates of species diversity after the hurricane. We may compare similar ecosystems, one of which suffered a natural disaster like a hurricane, and one of which didn't. And the final kind of experiments are manipulative experiments. So these are experiments where we manipulate some element of the environment. And in these experiments, we try as best as we can to control the rest of the environmental inputs so that we can focus on the effects of this manipulation specifically. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about one of these manipulative experiments, in this case conducted over a very wide scale. So this is a figure from your textbook that discusses a long-term ecological study of the Konza prairie. So the prairies are kind of grassland habitats that are maintained by a regime of grazing, by cattle or bison, and by periodic burning. And so in the diagram you can see the plots are divided by the kind of grazing that occurs there. So these areas are grazed by bison. The grey areas are grazed by cattle, and the light green areas are ungrazed. And then you have these black areas which represent agricultural land. And then the numbers within these plots represent the number of years between burns. And so there's a number of manipulations going on here, and what they're looking at is what's the combination of these factors and the interaction between these factors that affect the health and success of these prairie habitats. So to me, I think the important thing about looking at an experiment like this one is because it highlights the importance of considering heterogeneity in space and time. So heterogeneity just essentially means diversity. And so what I mean by heterogeneity is that the effects of certain factors that we might be studying, let's say the effect of bison grazing versus cattle grazing on a prairie habitat, the effects of those manipulations might vary from place to place over a landscape, or they might vary from year to year or from season to season. And so to understand these relationships, we need to study those relationships over a range of different scales and a range of different times. And different ecological processes that we study naturally occur at different scales. And so sometimes when we're developing an experiment or trying to test a hypothesis, deciding the scale and the time scale at which we're going to measure that phenomenon is an important part of the scientific process. So this is a figure from your textbook that illustrates that point really well. And it just looked at the relationship between time in years and space at which we study different ecological phenomena. So, for example, if we look at A here, what A represents is CO2 transport in leaves, so essentially kind of photosynthetic rate. So when we measure photosynthetic rate in a plant, we use apparatus that literally measure CO2 transport over a surface of a leaf that's maybe kind of a few centimetres squared. And so CO2 transport in leaves is measured over very short time periods in very small spaces. And if we contrast that with I, so I represents climate change or paleoecology, these are things that necessarily are studied on a global scale, and they're studied over hundreds of years. So just to look at an intermediate level here, D, what D represents is the study of annual plants. So annual plants are plants that complete their entire life cycle. So they germinate, they grow, they reach reproductive fitness, they reproduce, and then they die, all in the space of a year. And so it checks out that the study of annual plants would take place over a period of time roughly equal to a year. So this is another figure from your textbooks, and I think it illustrates really well the importance of considering spatial scale when we're asking ecological questions. So sometimes when we think about, for example, plant distributions, we might more commonly think about it on a global scale. So how does vegetation differ in the tropics versus temperate climates versus towards the poles? But if we look at really much smaller spatial scales, we can see totally different relationships that don't necessarily relate to those much more broad global scale relationships. So this figure shows just an individual hill, and the south-facing part is warmer, it gets more sunlight, so it has denser vegetation. It's home to plants that are more competitive in high sunlight environments. Whereas the cooler north-facing part of the hill might have, for example, groundhogs burrowing in it that prefer cooler conditions. And that means that plants on that part of the hill have to suffer herbivory from groundhogs that plants on the south-facing part of the hill don't have to suffer. Plants at the top of the hill are much more exposed to wind. Plants at the bottom of the hill have completely different climatic considerations to address. So we have what's called cold air drainage. We know that hot air rises and cold air sinks. And so these plants at the bottom of the hill are going to be subject to frost potentially at the end of summer and the start of spring, where plants at the top of the hill or on the south-facing slope may only get frost for a very short period of the year, or maybe not even at all. And all of these factors are going to have a big impact on the distribution of plant species over this relatively small area. So I just wanted to finish with a quick quote by John Muir that I think sums up ecology really nicely. And he said that when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world.